Hey everybody, Dutch Sense here. 5:44 p.m. Central Time on Friday, April 29th, 2016. And I've got you looking at Earthquake 3D, which is a USGS feed of the most recent earthquakes. And right now we're looking at the last 24 hours of activity, 2.5 and greater in the US and territories, 4.0 and greater internationally. And to really give you an idea of what's happened this week, I really have to take it down another notch to the last 48 hours of activity. Then you'll see that a 7.0 earthquake struck here in the West Pacific, followed by a 6.7, 6.9 revised earthquake here off the coast of Central America, and those were pretty much back to back over a few hours' time. Does that sound familiar? This goes back a week and a half now to the Japan earthquake, the large 7.0 plus earthquake that struck in South Japan, followed by the 7.8 that struck in Ecuador. And professionals a week ago came out in the media and said there was no relation between earthquakes across distances. And this ties into a long-held dogma in geology that earthquakes don't transfer across regions and that one earthquake doesn't cause another earthquake. They're going to have to adjust those theories in light of other things that are happening that we're seeing happen right before our eyes, such as the transfer of earthquakes across the plate in a few hours' time. Also, transfer of earthquakes across intermountain regions like the North American Craton or over here in Asia going across the Himalayas. So I'm going to just get into the earthquake forecast. I'm not going to recap every earthquake that struck this past week, but I would like to quickly just go over the United States and South America, Central America, because we're looking at a renewed threat of a large earthquake to develop out here in the Pacific over the next 7 days. And when you look at the activity in the United States over the last 24 to 48 hours, you'll see an earthquake that stands out in the South U.S. that's very rare. A 3.0 struck down here in Alabama, in central Alabama, and then we saw a series of earthquakes strike in succession from Yellowstone all the way down to San Francisco. Each one of these is associated with a dormant volcano. The 2.9 and 2.6 striking on the flanks of the underground magma chamber for Yellowstone, which is now confirmed to be 11 Grand Canyons worth and reaching all the way up here into Montana and west into Idaho. So 2 earthquakes on that perimeter. Then we get down here to the 2.5 that struck in northeast California near Lassen Volcano. Then you see the 2.8 and the other 2.7 that struck here north of San Francisco. Those as well striking at a volcano, Clear Lake Volcano, and the geysers. Then we get further down south in Southern California, and Salton Sea volcanic buttes near Cerro Prieto volcano was struck. So I'd like to show a few of these locations to you just to give you an idea of what's going on. We'll start with the rare earthquake in Alabama. Again, a 3.0. Don't normally see activity at this location, but when we do, it's always at a fracking operation that's nearby this area. So every time we see movement strike here, it's usually when the plate is in flux and the craton is moving. Look where Alabama falls on the edge of the craton. And now let's go look up the location and see what's there. Now this is the first time I've looked up this particular earthquake, but in the past we've seen other earthquakes happen in this location. So here's the location in question, and I already have this marked as massive fracking operation. But when we zoom in, you're going to see all these different little pads here. These aren't houses, these aren't farms. As you can see here, as I zoom in on one of these pads, you can see the outline of the oil well or gas well that's here. That's the pump apparatus. They'll connect these via underground pipelines, and this is just the southern portion of that. It reaches all the way down here, and it goes all the way up north. And we're talking about literally thousands of different little operations here. And when you zoom in on the area, you guys can inspect a little bit more. But the reason that an earthquake is striking there is because the edge of the craton is now in flux due to the activity that occurred over the past few days down here to the south. Go back and watch my video from yesterday telling everybody to watch out for a new swarm at the fracking operations here in the Midwest, and it happened. Also warning people along the eastern seaboard going down to the south yesterday that we would see new activity today or in the next few days, and it has struck. So what does this mean for the United States? Well, let's get into the forecast. The way we forecast the earthquakes is we look over the last 48 hours internationally. This helps us to determine the silent spots versus the areas that have moved, and possibly the magnitudes that should strike over the next 7 days, assuming nothing else plays into these factors. So if we don't see a solar eruption, if we don't see a coronal hole face us, for instance, or new deep earthquakes that occur, that can switch things up a little bit. But right now, as it stands, you can see that the whole West Pacific has moved from the Kuril Islands north of Japan all the way down here south to Fiji. All on a 4.0 level, most on a 4.6 to 4.8 level. That's again over the last 48 hours. This is a vast region to move over the last 48 hours. And then we saw the 7.0 strike after all of these 4.0 struck. So what does that mean for the next 7 days? Look for a silent spot in here, and that will be most likely the spot where we see additional compensation movement that's much larger. To get an idea on that, let's turn the rings down a little, and you'll see we have equidistantly spaced 4.0 activity from South Japan's epicenter from a week and a half ago, where the 7.0 struck, north to Kuril Islands, right across the Izu Ridge, again equidistantly spaced, all the way down here to Fiji. There's two silent spots that I see that haven't moved yet. That's far west Sumatra, South Indonesia. In this pocket right in here, this also is the Philippines right here. So we have Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines all meeting right in this region. This region hasn't shown any large-scale movement. You'll remember back just a few weeks to a few months, the swarms of large earthquakes that struck here and the multiple volcanic eruptions. Well, that has pretty much ceased. Have you heard about any new blasts happening in Indonesia recently? No. Well, that means building pressure, and of course building pressure in an earthquake-prone area, as we know from past experience, is not good. And it usually releases either with a single larger earthquake or a swarm all in one spot. Both can be damaging in their own right, but we hope for the swarm as opposed to the single larger earthquake. So we have the silent spot right here in South Indonesia. Where else are we going to watch? Well, there's a silent spot in between Japan and Philippines, which is Taiwan. The USGS has not reported the dozens of 4.0 earthquakes that have struck back to back right on top of each other. You would see them here if they were reporting them. The Europeans reported them, but they're not on the feed anymore. They only report the last 50 on their Earthquake 3D feed on the European EMSE feed. So this means Taiwan is moving, and it's most likely moving because of the 3 feet of lateral movement that's occurred here in South Japan. Look at the screen here, guys. Look at the pictures. Look at that movement that occurred in South Japan. It's amazing. So there's going to be large-scale compensation movement in either direction. We've already seen swarms of 4 and 5 strike over the last week in the areas that we were watching for, which is what we were watching for. But that single larger earthquake struck right next to the deep earthquakes that struck. Let's just go ahead and show those to you. The higher these are off the Earth, the deeper they are into the planet. It's an Earthquake 3D feature. Longtime viewers already know this. But you see this huge cluster of earthquakes here that occurred roughly 4 and 5 days ago. Well, that all preceded this large, shallow movement. Every time we see deep earthquakes, it's followed up nearby by shallow, larger movement, 1 to 2 magnitudes larger than the largest of the deep movement. And the deep movement was in the 5.3 range, and then we saw 7.3 strike here, downgraded to 7.0. So 2 magnitudes larger struck within 3 days of the deep earthquakes occurring. That happens almost every time. So if we see new deep earthquakes develop here in the West Pacific, that will then switch things up on areas to watch, and you have to watch next to the deep earthquakes for that shallow, larger movement to occur. If we see deep earthquakes up here near Japan again, then we have to watch to the west for possible larger movement to occur along the Himalayan range. And we'll get into the Himalayan, we'll get into Europe. I have less viewers there. We're going to get into the United States next. So we really just have one main region to watch here, which is huge, hasn't moved, should show compensation movement fairly large in the next 7 days, at least similar to the compensation movement that we'd expect off this 7.0 here near Vanuatu. Also to the east, once we get over to the East Pacific, that 7.0 to our south has started to push the craton up from the south, which we don't normally see. Normally we have pressure coming from the northwest and pushing to the southeast. But this activity here has caused, and it's obvious, a perturbance down to the south, in the Midwest, and in the southwest. And this is going to lead to new earthquakes developing out along the Intermountain West, also as far east as Colorado, as far west as the border of California and Nevada. Dormant volcanoes reside here at the border of California and Nevada. I did a video on this. They've upped the threat level of a large earthquake at the border of California and Nevada. They had a whole conference on it this past week, a geologic conference on the threat level at this location. Well, now that we have pressure coming up from the south and we have this silent zone up here to the northwest, they would have us believe that nothing over 2.5 has struck off the coast here in the last several weeks. If that's true, which I don't think it is, but if it's true, then that means there's tremendous building pressure off the west coast. But I think they're not reporting them, personally. It's my opinion. I have the right to my opinion. I have a reason behind that opinion, which I won't get into now, other than to say that the people that are controlling the actual network up there have come to my pages to say some horrible things to me personally. And they control the seismographs, they control the information coming out of there, and there's no earthquakes happening there. It's like no earthquakes happening at Yellowstone. You just know there's earthquakes happening there that they're just not reporting. So that just leads me into the final stage on the U.S. forecast, which is the edge of the craton. So we have to watch along the edge of the craton to the south and to the west because the pressure is coming in both directions now. Pressure from up here pressing to the east-southeast, pressing from the south to the north-northeast. All this is going to push right into Colorado, into the fracking operations, into Texas, and into Southern California. I wouldn't be surprised if we do see a noteworthy earthquake strike in Southern California this week, most likely near a pumping operation, like a fracking operation in Southern California, oil, gas, that sort of thing. And at the dormant volcanoes, again, keep watch for that larger movement, and it could get noteworthy this time because we have pressure coming in, again, from both directions, pressing on this area like a V inward to the Intermountain West, which should cause noteworthy earthquakes at all the dormant volcanoes and most likely as far north as Yellowstone. So we're moving the threat slightly inland this time, but don't rule out the movement off the coast in the silent zone to the northwest. This may go, and if it goes, it would either go in a small swarm of 4 to 5.0 earthquakes or one single larger 6, mid-6, something similar to what we're seeing down here to the south. This leads me into South America and Central America. We've seen this movement over the last 48 hours. No compensation to the east yet, direct east, except for a few earthquakes at Dominican Republic and in Puerto Rico. This means the Cayman Trench south of Cuba, Honduras, going east right along where my mouse is here, over to Jamaica. We may see renewed activity along this region. Caribbean, you don't normally see large earthquakes, so when you do have a threat building, you should be aware that you're an island region. There could be the threat of a tsunami wave if the earthquake gets above that mid 6.0 range. I would expect to see similar compensation movement to the east. In the past, we've seen it strike as far east as east of Barbados, sometimes right here along the trench. And when it strikes along the trench, usually it strikes in a succession of 5.0 earthquakes all the way across the trench. But if it were to build in one large earthquake, then we'd be seeing something similar to what we're seeing here. As we go further south, as I explained in my last video, the pressure always transfers down the coast of South America and around to the South Sandwich Islands. That held true this past week. Take a look at the swarm that occurred down here at the South Sandwich. So the large earthquake struck up here to the north, pressed down here to the south. We saw the pressure spill underneath the plate, and that's the deep earthquakes raised high off the globe here. So you can see deep earthquakes have occurred recently, again as the pressure transfers down underneath the plate, and then it finds a place to release over here to the east at the South Sandwich, and whatever pressure isn't released here travels just a little bit further east and always releases with 1 or 2 smaller earthquakes here to the east. So after a swarm of 5s, you'll see 1 5 strike south of South Africa. The same holds true with the central portion of South America and the south portion of Central America. When the pressure transfers to the east, you see 1 single earthquake usually strike, whatever's left over, strike over here to the east. And look where it struck, guys. At the 4.9, I went over this in my last video, the Romansh fracture zone. I went in, zoomed in on it, told you guys to watch the Romansh fracture zone. We'll open it up and just verify that that's where it is. Here's the chain. Here's the Romansh, I can't pronounce that right, but that's where it struck. And it always strikes there to the east after we see excessive pressure over here. Whatever's left over goes over to the east. And the same holds true in the North Atlantic. Whenever we see earthquakes spill across the plate here to the east, we see 1 single, 2 single releases along the mid-Atlantic as the final stop-off point for that pressure. And this is just great. Look at it, guys, right here. These are the earthquakes of the last 7 days, 2.5 and greater in the U.S. You can see the edge of the craton move just as we would expect. I would like to point out the 2.6 that struck up here in the middle of New Brunswick, Canada. Not normally earthquake prone. You don't normally hear earthquake forecast or anybody talking about New Brunswick as a spot to watch. Well, you need to go back and watch my last earthquake forecast video where I named out New Brunswick directly. I'm not bragging. I'm just trying to let you guys know that New Brunswick was named for earthquakes to strike there this week, and it was struck right at the center of New Brunswick. And the reason New Brunswick moved is because last week we saw this kind of activity again. So we can expect the eastern seaboard is going to show similar activity to what we just saw today up the East Coast. You'll remember back to 2011. You remember all the 4.0, upper 4.0 earthquakes that struck in southeast Quebec going down towards New York? Many of you may not remember. You weren't paying attention or they didn't report it to you. I covered those events at the time, and that was at a time where we were seeing fracking earthquakes redevelop in the Midwest and activity off the West Coast in the 6.0 range. That's happening again now, so it's prudent to have an earthquake plan ready and be prepared just in case. And this holds true around the world. If you're watching my video internationally, you need to be aware that when we see large earthquake activity here in the West Pacific, and if we do see that large-scale release here in Indonesia, that's going to put tremendous pressure to the west. Just like in the United States, where the pressure transfers to the east along the edge of the craton, over here in the West Pacific, it transfers to the west and spills over across Asia. Let's go ahead and show you the last 7 days. You can connect the earthquakes from the West Pacific right over to Europe. Europe was named for this movement. You see the 3.9s, the rare 3.9 earthquakes, a cluster of 3.9s strike across France and North Italy going into Austria. North Italy and Austria were named last week, as well as France. They're not normally earthquake prone, but the reason I named them out is because of the activity that was developing down here to the south. And that was based upon the activity that was pressing from the West Pacific across the Himalayan range. So it's happening again now. So when we look at the last 48 hours of activity, you can see there's one single release spot near Afghanistan and silence across Nepal, Burma, Bangladesh, reaching down into Indonesia, which was the area we just warned at the start of the video. Well, the area to the west should move. And silence is not good in earthquake-prone areas, as I've said before. These are earthquake-prone areas, and they're silent, which means we should see building pressure in the region release in the next 7 days. It'll be similar to or equal to the movement that we see release here in the next few days here in Indonesia. So if you see new deep earthquakes, for instance, strike here, that will then push, and we'll see 1 to 2 magnitudes larger here at Burma, Nepal, Western China. Further west in Europe, we have to go check the European feed. We'll open up the EMSC. I recommend you guys download a copy of Earthquake 3D. It's worth the $20 if you're going to buy the full version. If you're not going to buy it, get the free version. It still helps, and you just don't get the flashy graphics with this. You'll get a screen that just shows you the Earth in a grid. But it still helps to see where the earthquakes are striking and understand which zones are silent, which zones should move over the next 7 days. Well, we have a huge cluster of 2s and 3s, borderline 4, striking down here in South Europe. If you add in the additional deep earthquake, the very rare deep earthquake that struck yesterday in Serbia and Eastern Europe, first time I've ever seen a deep earthquake like this strike in Eastern Europe. In the 6 or 7 years now that I've been covering earthquakes in detail, never seen a deep earthquake like that in Eastern Europe. I'm not saying it's never happened, but I've never seen one. And usually deep earthquakes are followed by shallow, larger movement, 1 to 2 magnitudes larger. A 3.9, 3.6 struck at a depth of 500 kilometers, 300 miles below Europe. That means somewhere adjacent to that region should move in the next 7 days, and it should be at least 1 to 2 magnitudes larger than the 3.6 that struck. Once you start getting into that 5.0 range and you get into North Europe, you're talking about Belgium, Poland, Netherlands, going as far west as the English Channel. This area is under now serious threat for that 4 to 5.0 earthquake to strike because of the deep movement down below the plate. If you add in the other pressure coming from the Pacific, that's the perfect storm for North Europe for that some kind of activity to be striking in the earthquake-prone areas. And now we're talking about a fairly small area across North Europe. We're talking about the English Channel, North France, coast of Normandy, going across Belgium, going across North Germany, going across Netherlands, into Poland. And somewhere in this region here should show that compensation movement. If it strikes to the south, let's say from Cern at Switzerland all the way over to Serbia, I wouldn't be shocked, but I'd be more leaning towards the north for that movement to strike because it hasn't struck yet. Already struck Central Europe over the past 7 days. And you see that the swarm of 3.9s surrounding Switzerland. I would like to point out that the weasel that got into CERN and caused a shutdown today, well, they're doing a beam drop still. The beam was at full power, and then they have this problem where they have to shut down. Now, I would say that the swarm of 4s happening all around Switzerland might be a problem, and the large earthquakes that are striking back to back while CERN's in operation over and over again, whether it's Nepal last year or a year and a half ago, or in Japan in 2011. Why is CERN in operation when all these big earthquakes are striking? I'm just curious about that. Just wondering. And I'm wondering how a weasel got into CERN to shut it down. I think I know, and maybe if you're looking at the screen here right now, you might understand who the weasel is that caused CERN to get shut down. But I digress. So as we see the earthquake striking here in Central Europe, South Europe, that means North Europe's under pressure. Ultimately, the pressure will transfer to the mid-Atlantic ridge from Europe and release here to the north. Just like the U.S. presses over here to the central mid-Atlantic, and Central America and South America press to the South Atlantic, these earthquakes will eventually progress up here towards Iceland, up towards Svalbard, as far as the North Pole. We've seen this happen over and over again, as far back as the Bardabunga eruption in Iceland, when we saw large earthquakes, 6.8s, strike back to back. Again, related earthquakes across the distance, and that was followed by Bardabunga erupting as the pressure transfers to the west. And North Pole earthquakes, again, following North Europe earthquakes as the pressure presses from the Pacific all the way across Europe up here to the north. Proof that earthquakes are progressing across the distance. And I'm going to end the video now by telling you there's a link down below to a detailed post that I put together about earthquake progression and earthquake forecasting, what to watch for, where to watch for it. That's on top of my How to Forecast an Earthquake post that's been public now for almost 2 years. The professionals were wrong to say that earthquakes are not related across a distance. They're wrong. And they're wrong that earthquakes don't progress. They're wrong that one smaller earthquake cannot cause another smaller earthquake elsewhere. It's proved. We see 3.0s here down to the south cause 3.0s up here to the north, 1,000 miles away over the course of a few days' time. They are related. The denial is based upon an old dogma in geology that they don't want to correct. We still have teachers teaching this in schools, textbooks saying it incorrectly, that earthquakes cannot be forecast, that earthquakes are not related across distances, and they even said it in the media last week when they tried to deny the relation between the 7.0 in Japan and the 7.0 in Ecuador. Now this week, a 7.0 strikes in Vanuatu and a 7.0 strikes off the coast of Central America. You cannot overlook it. They called it a coincidence last week. What is it this time? Don't coincidences cease to be coincidences when they happen all the time? So guys, much love. Always have an earthquake plan ready and be prepared just in case. You may never have to use it. You hope you never have to use it. But just know what you'll do when you're inside of a structure and a large earthquake strikes. So just be ready and be prepared. Dust off your plans. Know what you'll do just in case. I'm not telling you to buy stockpiles of food and water. That's not necessary at this point, especially when you're just talking in the 6.0 range. But it's enough to cause major damage. It's enough to knock things off shelves, cause damage to your house. And if you don't know what to do when that's happening, that's when injuries occur. Most of the injuries in earthquakes occur from falling structures, falling debris. So just keep that in mind, guys, okay? So much love. Be safe.